For more, we now have Deborah Elms, Head of Trade Policy, Hinrich Foundation, joining us. Deborah, thank you so much for joining us. Perhaps we could start off with your initial reaction to these sweeping new tariffs. It appears no country has been spared. Is this what you were expecting from his Liberation Day announcement?
Yes and no. I thought that he would have universal tariffs. I thought it might be higher even than 10%, so I'm happy that it was only 10% as the baseline. But what is a surprise is which countries got much higher tariffs, and most of that damage is actually done in our region here in Asia, with tariffs as high almost as 50% on a wide range of countries, based largely on what is the size of their trade deficit with the United States and nothing more.
Well, the tariffs were expected to take effect immediately, but the administration has now announced the universal 10% baseline rate will go into effect on 5th of April, while the customized rates will take effect on 9th of April. Does this mean there's room for negotiation? How could this play out?
Yeah, I think they gave enough time for firms to put things onto ships and to give especially Customs and Border Patrol time to deal with the auto tariffs, which just started a half an hour ago. And so I think they wanted to give a little bit of time for those auto tariffs to come into force before they added in all of these new baseline tariffs and then add in the reciprocal tariffs, because the chaos at the border is going to be high. Remember as well that they just eliminated de minimis for China and Hong Kong shipments. So that's 4 million packages a day that Customs is now going to have to go through. The complexity of getting things across the border is going to be really unbelievable.
Well, lots of countries warning of dire consequences on global trade, some vowing countermeasures. Perhaps you could help us understand what kind of impact will we see here in Asia and how much pain could these tariffs really cause?
I think it's going to vary. It's going to vary by country. It's going to vary by sector. It's going to vary by level of dependence on the U.S. market. But the consequences overall are going to be unpleasant and challenging, especially for many of our developing country neighbors like Cambodia, Laos, even Vietnam got hit with very high levels. And those are going to be problematic because they're very dependent on the U.S. market, particularly for those countries for exports of garments, footwear, electronics. And if you look at those products, you say, well, where else can we sell things in the same way? It's less lucrative if you sell outside of the United States. Now, they may be able to maintain market share because other places also got hit. So Bangladesh, Pakistan, et cetera, other garment and footwear producers also got hit with similar high tariffs. So that may not be so catastrophic. But the question then is, how many Americans are going to be buying new shoes? If the price of shoes just shot up overnight by more than 40%, you can imagine that customers in the U.S. are going to say, do I really need a second pair of shoes today? Answer, probably not. And so I think it's not just what the tariffs mean, it's also what is the consumer or business behavior in terms of buying these products. And then what happens in the retaliation, the counter retaliation, where do those products go if they're not going to the United States? I think there is a lot of turmoil ahead. And so while we were thinking we would have clarity today, I don't think we actually have clarity today. We have a bit more, but we're not yet at the end of what is going to be a very bumpy ride.
Well, many countries have also, voiced out their unhappiness. Do you think really the retaliatory tariffs from other countries would have any impact on the Trump administration? Will they budge, or will all these countries really be forced to bow down to U.S. demands?
I think that is, of course, one of the many open questions that we have. I think the U.S. at the moment, at least the Trump administration, appears to be resolute. But it's one thing to declare that you're resolute standing in the Rose Garden when you make this announcement. It's another thing when you have very angry constituents who can't afford to buy clothing for their children, food for their dinner table, the new vehicle to replace the one that is no longer functioning. I mean, those are much harder decisions to make when you get down the path and you see the pain in American voters.
Well, Deb, how long could this trade war really go on for? Do you expect this will be prolonged? And if so, what are the consequences of that?
I think it's going to be a long time. I mean, it took us 80 years to get the system to where it is today, or where it was today, before Trump just wrecked it. So, I mean, I hope it's not 80 years before we create an alternative, but it's not going to be a fast process. It's going to be painstaking. It's going to be forward and backward. As governments try to decide, do they retaliate? Do they express their displeasure and stop there? Do they express their displeasure, see what happens? Do they try to negotiate? Do they respond to retaliation? Do they respond to counter retaliation with more retaliation? Do they collectively come together in some way? I think we just don't know yet how this is going to play out. But I think that the contradictory impulses from governments around the world are going to be on stark display, and the level of chaos and uncertainty is going to continue for, I think, a long time.
So much of ambiguity just based off what you just shared. I'm just wondering, what is Mr. Trump's endgame right here? Could his tariff moves really backfire on him?
I think Mr. Trump is able to hold 6 contradictory ideas in his head at the same time. And so the problem you're seeing right now is what happens when those 6 contradictory ideas meet the real world. And yes, there will be real consequences. There will be real pain experienced in the United States. There will be real challenges outside of the U.S. He has gone against countries that are traditional allies of the U.S. He has gone against countries that have almost no relationship. He's even imposed, which I find amazing, there are even tariffs on places that have no inhabitants. I mean, that's how crazy this is. So, the consequences of that kind of behavior, I think, is unknown. We don't normally have governments, and certainly not a government like the United States, imposing tariffs on islands owned by penguins. I mean, it doesn't even make any sense.
Absolutely. I mean, that's an interesting factor to share. But what would the U.S., apart from just Mr. Trump, what would the U.S., America, consider a win for, or successful outcome from imposing these sweeping tariffs?
Again, there's contradictory impulses here. One of them is to rebuild manufacturing. So U.S. jobs in manufacturing is about 8% of jobs in the United States. So under any crazy scenario you can imagine, what do we get to 20% of jobs in manufacturing? That means that you have harmed most of the jobs. By far, the vast majority of jobs are in the services sector. You are, by default, harming your services sector in order to support manufacturing jobs for no clear reason. It's not obvious, at least not obvious to me, why a job in a manufacturing factory is a better job than a job in healthcare, than a job in construction, than a job in retail. Those jobs are just as good a jobs, I think. But for some reason, this particular administration has a fetish over manufacturing jobs, and they want to increase those manufacturing job levels. That's going to be hard to do. It's expensive to do that in the United States. A lot of it's going to be replaced by automation rather than by workers. And the costs are just going to be catastrophic, both to firms and to Americans. And so I don't know if at the end of a very long and painful period, you actually budge American manufacturing levels much above 8%, which is where they're at right now.
I know, Deborah, we have run out of time, but thank you so much for addressing all the questions. Deborah Elms, Head of Trade Policy, Hinrich Foundation.